really excited and honored to be presenting as part of a Nomicon this year. A special thanks, first off the bat, for Ryan for having me here, and for everybody who I know is working behind the scenes to make this come off in one piece. I'm really thrilled to be discussing a case with you that is near and dear to my heart. I am not sure whether it's genuine or a hoax. The way that I view the history of ufology is that we should be talking about all these cases, whether or not they are frauds or they are genuine cases, because it's all part of the history of this. And there's some evidence that we'll be discussing towards the end that suggests that it was a hoax. But at the very least, it's an interesting case, and it has some evidence that you don't normally get in cases like this. And evidence that has, to my knowledge, since disappeared. So partially I'm seeking to bring this case to everyone's attention, and partially I'm also hoping that maybe we can track down some of these photographs that are mentioned, and I've got some black and white photos to share with you, but maybe we can track them down, and maybe there's someone else who in this particular part of the world can help shed some light on this mystery. I mentioned it being in a specific part of the world. A lot of the pronunciations we'll be coming up against are Basque and Catalan. I'm doing my best to pronounce them correctly, so forgive me if I don't. The pronunciation issues start right away with the individual's name. Djinn, Dolmens, and Doppelgängers, revisiting the Xavier Clarés Jerez case. I've spoken to some individuals in this part of the world who say Xavier is probably the closest that we can get to actually pronouncing his name correctly. So let's just dive right in to what I think is a really interesting little gem in the history of ufology. On Sunday, July 21st, 1985, 23-year-old Xavier Clarés Jerez returned home from a day trip. As you can see, we don't have a picture of Xavier, so maybe that's a red flag right off the bat. But he was surprised when he got home, because even though it was a Sunday morning, he noticed that a lot of the shops were still open. His wife and brother, who lived with him, asked where he had been. As it turned out, he'd been missing for 34 hours. His car was filthy, and the odometer had an extra 150 miles or so on it, despite his trip only being 30 minutes away. Over the coming months, his story would only get stranger and stranger, including a series of very peculiar photos, which we'll be seeing here in a moment. A little bit of background on what we know about Xavier. He was born August 7th, 1961, in Almeria, on Spain's southern coast. He displayed an interest in photography relatively early and became a professional photographer. And eventually, when he was in his 20s, he moved to Barcelona, where he shared a residence with his wife and brother, Jose. According to reports at the time, Xavier ran a small studio of industrial drawing and photography. Again, I have to relish in the irony of someone who is a photographer not being readily... Not being easy to find their photo on the internet. I think that's really interesting, but who knows? There were plenty of people at the time who thought that there was something to the case and met Xavier, so we know that he was, and maybe still is, a real human being who's still alive. But on July 21st, Xavier set out to photograph the Dolmen de la Pedra Gentil in Vallgorguina. This is about 30 miles or 45 minutes down the coast. You can see a picture of Barcelona to Vallgorguina on your screen there. The dolmen that you see here on the left, that is the actual dolmen. Anyone who doesn't know what a dolmen is, it's sort of a standing Neolithic structure, often an open-air tomb sometimes. Very closely associated with fairy folk and other mythical and mystic beasts over the years, over the centuries. This particular dolmen is kind of small. It's only about 5 feet tall. We'll be seeing some other pictures of it, but that should give you some idea of the scale of this photograph. The dolmen actually shares property with a Romanesque church, which has led some people to speculate that it actually started in a separate location and was moved, although it's not uncommon to see holy sites sort of brought together and syncretized and one being built upon another. What's really interesting about the Pedra Gentil dolmen is that it has a long-standing association with black magic. There are rumors, and I believe even some documentation of witches' sabbaths taking place there. And interestingly enough, Vallgorguina possibly is taken from the Basque words Vallgorguina, or Valley of the Witches. So this was the place that Xavier was setting out to photograph on that Sunday in 1985. Most of our knowledge of this case, in the English-speaking world at least, comes to us from Spanish ufologist Antonio Ribera. He talked about this quite extensively in an issue of Flying Saucer Review. So let's set the scene here. It was a clear, cloudless day. Javier left at 8 a.m. with a full tank of gas and 2 cameras. He had a homemade, old-fashioned box camera and a Japanese-made Olympus OMB 35mm camera loaded with 100 ASA 21 DIN film for color photographs. If you're a photographer, maybe that means something to you. It doesn't mean a lot to me, but there's some information that might be helpful. He was driving his red Renault 5 hatchback, probably quite similar to the one we have on this slide. By all accounts, Javier was meticulous and always noted his odometer before leaving on a trip and when he came back. So this is why we're actually able to believe him when he says that there was a discrepancy in the amount of mileage that it showed. He goes to the dolmen. According to what he recalled, he spent about 90 minutes there photographing it, and he returned home. And once he got to town, he was very surprised because it looked like all the businesses were open. Not something that you'd expect on a Sunday morning in Spain at the time. He also noticed when he got out of his car that despite a dry spell at the time, his car was filthy and wet, covered in thick, sticky stains from an unknown substance. His wheels and chassis were smothered in mud as well. Again, we don't have photographs of what happened to his car. For a case that centers around photography like this one, I find that, again, very ironic, but we'll get to why perhaps we don't have any evidence of what was on his car later on in the presentation. However, once he spoke with his sister and brother, he discovered not only his missing time, but the fact that they were very concerned about him, and he also discovered that some of the photographs on his camera had advanced, as if pictures had been taken. This case, again, as I mentioned, came to my attention through an old issue of Flying Saucer Review, the May 1986 issue, to be precise, in an article by Antonio Ribera. The photographs were also printed in Flying Saucer Review at the time. Because it was FSR, they were saving on ink, and the photos are in black and white, although the original photos were in color. So Javier decides to develop what's on his camera, and this is what he finds. The first photo appears to show a symmetrical face. For me, I think pareidolia seems unlikely. I mean, it's so symmetrical, it does indeed look like a face. According to the reports of this original photo, it was actually green. But I think it takes very little imagination to see a large wrinkled forehead, eyes, a flat nose, and a fat-lipped mouth. Now I'm going to go through the other photos here as well, but don't worry, these will all appear at several points in the presentation, so you can ignore me and focus on those because they're far more interesting than I am. The second photo is quite a bit darker. It also seems to show a face, but it shows more of the head. This is where we should probably address Javier's method of actually making these photos visible at all. He was developing his photos, and they were all extremely dark. This implied a long exposure time, which we will get to in a moment. The photos were very dark, and in order to enhance the contrast, Javier took the original plates, made a contratype, and then kept developing and developing and developing until these images emerged. That might be a red flag for some people, I'm not sure. But it does appear to show a head or a helmet. We don't get a lot of detail in this photograph. Javier, being an artist and sort of a visually inclined person, did his own sketch of the entity's head and possibly helmet here. It looks like we have a helmet with maybe a conical shape, high-set ears, or other protrusions from the sides of the head. I think it looks like an Olmec head. I don't know if that has any relevance on the case itself. Photos 3 and 4 are of hands. We assume that these were green because everybody in the Flying Saucer Review article is saying green hands, green faces, etc. They look to be long... They look to be scaly hands with long, thin, dark nails against a white background. One of the hands appears to be manipulating a device. We will get to later what that device perhaps might have been. So Javier gets home and he speaks with his wife, speaks with his brother, and they realize that with the photos developed, that something odd happened in those missing 34 hours. He reaches out to parapsychologist Carol Ramis, a Vienna-born researcher in Barcelona. Again, this is perhaps another red flag. He actually knew Carol Ramis. Javier and his brother Jose had contacted her in the past about unsettling dreams from their childhood. Ribera wrote on the nature of these. For example, he had been visited in his bedroom at night by small humanoids of the classical type known to ufologists, big pear-shaped heads, small nimble bodies, who showed him a number of things including pyramids. But he always had the feeling about them, the little beings, that they were benevolent and would never do him any harm. This was a stark contrast to the beings that we would see later. Javier felt that these childhood experiences might have been more dreamlike, but what he experienced in 1985, he contended, was much more real. After seeing the photos and hearing his story, Ramis put Xavier in touch with Professor Francisco de Assis Rovadi Heredia, a Spanish parapsychologist who worked with other alleged alien abductees in the region. He claimed to hold a recognized diploma in hypnosis. Here's the only picture that I've been able to find of Heredia. According to Ribera, Heredia and Ramis noted that Xavier was young, fit, and healthy in both mind and body. After meeting Xavier himself, Ribera put him through some tests, evaluated him as a witness, and made several conclusions. That Xavier had 111 IQ, he had no psychotic traits whatsoever, and a disposition that struck him as a quiet, well-spoken, intelligent, normal, and thoroughly honest individual. He and Jose, his brother, were quote-unquote straight young men, quite unlikely to be guilty of committing a hoax. Heredia and Carol Ramis put Xavier through a hypnotic regression. I have a lot of problems with hypnosis. I'm sure some people in the audience have a lot of problems with hypnosis. I do think that there's some utility in it, but not as memory retrieval, but this is how they used it at the time in this case. So, caveat emptor. So let's talk about what Xavier remembered under hypnosis. This is actually, these are actual pictures of the road to the dolmen. You can see the road to the dolmen, the dirt road to the dolmen, and then the trail that you walk to the dolmen. According to Xavier, under hypnosis, he noticed that the road to the dolmen was shrouded in fog or mist. His next memory was lying next to the dolmen. Something began raining down upon him, presumably the same substance that later stained his car. He described this as a sort of liquid, sticky, and very nasty. He stood, reached for his keys, but could not find them. He wanted to go back to sleep, but knew that the strange rain would prevent that. Xavier said that this water that's dropping on me won't let me. I'm certain it's not water, and everything is covered in clouds. This is another picture of the interior of the dolmen there. At this point, Xavier noticed that his trunk was open. He retrieved his cameras and began taking photos with his homemade camera. However, he was immediately afraid that the rain would damage the cameras or the light would damage the film. This is why he didn't use the new one, upon which the photographs of the beings would later be discovered. At this point, Xavier says that he knows that he wasn't alone. He could see other presences around him so hideous that he averted his eyes, as best he could at least. He nevertheless described them as almost as tall as he was, if just a little bit less. Their faces are horrible, with dirty gray skin that Xavier said was furrowed, so this seems consistent with the photographs that he produced. Again, this is an actual photo of the dolmen and the hill, which plays a role in this story. Xavier says that the beings compelled him with an invisible force to travel down a nearby slope. Halfway he stumbled. Despite wanting to flee, he found himself walking into a deep cavern in the hillside. Inside this cavern, Xavier said that the atmosphere was suffocating. It smelled of rotten eggs, most likely hydrogen sulfide, a common theme in these encounters that I noticed in my book, Brimstone Deceit, and Coke. Not Coca-Cola, but a porous coal-based fuel that is gray and hard in its mineral form. The walls were also covered in a sticky substance, perhaps similar to what rained upon his car and him. At this point, the beings begin communicating with him. They tell him that they brought him underground to collect a sample of some sort from him. This is where one of the entities, who is differentiated by being the only woman having hair on its head, this is when that particular leader, if you want to call it that, produced a catheter-like instrument. Xavier sketched the tool later, seen here, which might be the object that is seen manipulated in the fourth photograph of the hands, you can see. The needle was thrust into Xavier's arm and extracted something. He refused to call this blood. It might have been blood, plasma, or honestly, with the way that this case ends up going, it might have been something ephemeral instead. Under hypnosis, Xavier revealed his conversation with the entities. He said, "Why don't they want to tell me? They know where I am from. That planet doesn't exist. I don't know of any planet called Cassiopeia, such as you were talking about, nor any place of that name. I still don't understand what I'm doing here, nor what you want. Why am I here? Just tell me. I don't understand it. You are making me more and more confused, and what you have put in my arm I don't like one bit. If there are any marks left on me, they'll be seen, and nobody will believe it. And why isn't that of any interest to you, that nobody should believe what I tell them? But anyway, I don't want to say anything to anybody, because they're going to take me for crazy, and I don't want that. I've always been a very steady sort of person. Never had this sort of thing happen to me. I don't believe I'm in here. I don't want to believe it. I must be dreaming. At any rate, it will all be over when I wake up. I'm not in here, and you don't exist. I can't believe it." Cassiopeia, of course, as we know, is not a planet. It's a constellation. It's also a great Japanese jazz fusion band, if any of you are interested. But it's interesting that he would say that name and then claim no knowledge of that as being something that actually is in the sky. Okay, if you're not ready for this next part, this is where it gets really weird, as if it isn't strange enough. Somehow, Javier still had his homemade box camera, and the entities tried taking pictures of him with it, but no one knows if they succeeded. There isn't any evidence to that. The entire time, Xavier, I keep on going back and forth, sorry about that. The entire time, Xavier was concerned that they might ruin the film in his camera. Perhaps they did, because any photos taken with that box camera have not shown up. We only have these photos that were taken with the Olympus camera. The beings also cut Xavier's hair. It was such a bad haircut that he said he eventually visited a barber in Barcelona to tidy it up because it was such a bad haircut. The beings then disclosed to him that they wished to make another one just like him and then wipe him out. Of course, to a lot of ufologists, this might imply something like cloning, and that is certainly the direction that this particular narrative goes. Xavier assured Ramus and Heredia that he was indeed the original. So there was no swapping out of a different Xavier at this point. The one sitting on the couch was the original. But at this point in the abduction narrative, Xavier falls asleep. Here we go. This is where it gets real strange. Xavier wakes and he's in his car, as it appeared on his return to Barcelona. So it's already muddy and dirty. I presume that the mileage is already altered at this point on his odometer. Taking stock of his situation, he discovers that the aliens took the 2 sandwiches that he had packed for lunch, which is a detail that I just love. Adding insult to injury, right? Xavier looked in his back seat and was shocked at what he saw. It was a perfect double of himself, with one exception. It still bore the long hair he had worn before his haircut from the entities. So you've got the real Xavier in the front seat, short hair, and this doppelganger or clone in the back seat with the longer hair. Ramus asked if this might be a reflection that he was remembering, and Xavier was adamant that this was not. No, it was an actually second version of himself in the car with him. Xavier said that he semi-consciously drove his double to Barcelona and dropped him off at the corner of Vallespir and Condes de Bellac, which is approximately this neighborhood here. Xavier then returned home. You might be asking yourself at this point, as I think is entirely appropriate, was this a psychotic break? There's a lot of strange details to this case that make it seem like something that was the product of a fantastic imagination. I think there are some problems with that, though. We have some evidence. First of all, Xavier seemed to be of sound mind both before and after his kidnapping. Second of all, we have the photos, which, although they might have been hoaxed, certainly imply that something happened of some sort. Third, Xavier had a puncture mark on his arm as late as September 1985. 3 wounds arranged in a 3-centimeter triangle, equilateral triangle, which Antonio Ribera observed. The fourth issue is that this double that he claimed to drop off in Barcelona was allegedly seen by others throughout town on several occasions. Ribera wrote in the Flying Saucer Review article, when Xavier became aware of the existence of this other copy of himself, the very idea, of course, horrified and disgusted him. What might befall his mirror double? And why had it been created in the first place? What for? But, as can well be imagined, his anguish increased tenfold when a neighbor remarked to him, "Xavier, what were you doing walking around like that near your place last Sunday?" The neighbor said this soon after his return home. The next day, in fact. He having only returned home, be it remembered, at 6 p.m. on the Monday, his abduction having taken place on that same Sunday. Again, the timeline gets a little bit convoluted here. There's more. Well, wait, there's more. Ribera continued. Some days later, another friend of Xavier's mentioned casually that he had seen him, Xavier, on the Avenida Marqués del Duero, popularly known as El Paralelo, a Barcelona street that Xavier had in fact not visited for months. When asked what clothes Xavier had been wearing, the friend gave a description. It was precisely the same clothing that Xavier was wearing on that ill-fated Sunday of his abduction. There was, however, yet worse to come. One night Xavier went to have dinner at his aunt's. The old lady was amazed at seeing him. "What? You again?" she said. "But you have just left, saying that you couldn't stay for dinner." The double would be seen at least twice more. On Saturday, November 16th, 1985, Xavier's double was seen on Barcelona's Paseo de Colón wearing a Hawaiian shirt, the same Hawaiian shirt that Xavier had worn the day he visited the dolmen 4 months earlier. Witnesses said that this particular double, if that's indeed what it was, looked incredibly sad as it waited patiently for the bus. That's public transportation for you, right? January 12th, 1986, this double was seen again. This time it was also wearing a Hawaiian shirt, but notice the date, the dead of winter. This raised a lot of questions as to why, if this was Xavier and not the double, he would be wearing a Hawaiian shirt in such cold weather. Ribera interviewed Xavier at length, noting that other peculiarities surrounded him. Among these were strange automobile difficulties where his car would break down, but, when examined by a mechanic, seemed to be in fine working order. With the exception of Ribera, however, other ufologists found Xavier's incredible story too much to swallow. Among the staunchest critics was Spanish ufologist Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos, who mainly took issue with what he called were sloppy hypnosis procedures. Fair enough, I totally get that. Even Ribera himself, however, wondered about aspects of Xavier's testimony. He felt that the discrepancy on the odometer might indicate that he drove to a different dolmen rather than the one in Vallgorguina. He suggested one near Palafrugell, northeast of Barcelona in Girona province, or another west of town in Lerida province Pilar region, near the municipality of Tremp. And as you can see, either of those locations out from Barcelona might account for the increased mileage on Xavier's odometer. Ribera tried to reconcile this, but folks like Olmos felt that there were further red flags. He said, "For me, it was a hoax or psychosis case, an unreliable testimony from a subject who was familiar as an insider to esoteric circles, an individual who was a witness of so-called bedroom visitations." Again, we've established that Xavier knew Carol Ramis and knew exactly who to go to after his experiences, so it kind of introduces a seed of doubt that maybe he was sort of prone to having an interest in this sort of thing, and that's maybe why it happened. Either he hoaxed it, or perhaps he was so suggestible that he misinterpreted a dream or something along those lines for what had happened to him. But they're those pesky photographs, It's part of why I find this case so interesting. However, what Olmos is referring to here is an incident from Xavier's childhood. As it turns out, Xavier was something of a repeater, as some ufologists call them. This is someone who has a recurring contact over their lifetime. Ribera actually interviewed Xavier about another encounter that might have been at the dolmen in Vallgorguina. He said, more extraordinary still, it now turns out that Xavier had already visited the dolmen at Vallgorguina or wherever it was on a previous occasion, 3 years ago. So this would have been 82. Moreover, on that occasion, there was also a period of missing time, namely from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Xavier has no clear conscious recollection of what happened on that day. All he knows is that at 11 a.m. and again at 7 p.m. he saw 2 triangles of light in the air about 10 meters or so above the dolmen. The upper triangle was upside down and into the lower one. All the colors of the spectrum were rotating from one point to another around each of the triangles. On the external triangle, the lights were going counterclockwise, and on the other inner triangle, they were going clockwise. This sort of testimony did nothing to impress folks like Ballester Olmos, who said, after Ribera, no one ever worried about the case, and, to the best of my memory, no one came back to it again. Probably it was too much even for gullible ufologists. Well, the more things change, the more they stay the same, I suppose. But I consider myself among one of the gullible ufologists here, because there are some things about this case that I simply cannot get out of my head as being quite compelling. One of the most damning things I think about it, honestly, is the fact that if he was in a cave, how was he able to take these pictures? There doesn't seem to be a flash used because it didn't really work that well if it did. Xavier suggested that perhaps the beings themselves were made of some sort of phosphorescence or radiance on their own. Ribera, even when he evaluated the case, was honest about the shortcoming of why the pictures were so dark and how the pictures could have happened at all in the cave. He pointed out that a photometer adjusted the shuttle aperture to the light on this particular camera, which would have blocked the camera if the light was insufficient. But, again, Xavier said that perhaps these were light beings. And that's something that you certainly hear in a lot of UFO testimony, is that some of these beings are made of light and have their own luminescence. Other details of Xavier's story also confirm to a variety of cases in the literature, cases not as readily available to the public in 1985 as they are today. So the idea is, where did he come up with these other aspects that you see in other cases in the pre-internet era? Again, we know that he was into ufology. He was into ufology and the supernatural, so maybe he was an avid reader, but it's still worth considering. So we have the light beings. There's also the case of the mist or fog, which is quite common in UFO experiences. For example, last year W.T. Watson released an excellent book, Mysteries in the Mist, Mist, Fog, and Clouds in the Paranormal. You see mist and fog in so many of these different encounters, and it's also in Xavier's encounter as well. There's also sticky slime, which we find, again, time and again in these cases. The Xavier Clarés Jerez case got a little bit of attention in Bill Chalker's book, Hair of the Alien. He took the case and compared it to several cases in his native Australia. Unfortunately, in the case of Xavier's goo that was all over his car, samples were never collected. There is the suggestion that perhaps they evaporated, similar to other UFO debris might have, like angel hair. The official explanation, though, is that Xavier, who we know was apparently a very fastidious person, he kept track of his odometer, he wasn't happy with his alien haircut, that he really liked to keep a clean car. So instead of preserving any of the evidence, he went and got his car cleaned shortly thereafter. Another compelling thing I find in this case is the odor. This really wasn't discussed as a common recurring theme. You saw it in paragraphs here and there in the paranormal literature, but it didn't really get any sort of long-form attention until, I wrote Brimstone Deceit in 2016. That doesn't mean that someone couldn't have sort of noticed this pattern beforehand. I mean, part of the reason I wrote that book is because I was noticing a pattern. But again, he described this sort of hydrogen sulfide odor, which you see across a lot of different alien abductions and even just straight-up structured craft UFO sightings. There's also the description of the beings themselves, which, being sort of having this sort of gray, folded, mummy-like skin. This is something that Eddie Bullard noted in his masterwork UFO Abductions, The Measure of a Mystery, that certain beings that have this mummy-like or sort of Shar-Pei-like skin. Think of, for example, the 1973 Pascagoula abduction as a classic example of that. So what did Xavier Clarés Jerez encounter, if anything at all? Flying Saucer Review editor Gordon Crichton suggested that they were Djinn. This should be taken with a grain of salt because during this era of Flying Saucer Review's history, Gordon Crichton was kind of Djinn crazy. He saw a lot of things as being Djinn. I'm certainly sympathetic to that. The Djinn are very similar to Western European fairies, to the degree that I think a case could be made that there were two culture-dependent attempts to describe the same phenomena. But Gordon Crichton entitled the Flying Saucer Review article, or then sort of structured around Xavier's story, entitled it "The Djinn and the Dolmen." Djinn, being analogous to certain European fairies, are closely associated with ancient megaliths. You can find this indicated some. Djinn, of course, come from Islamic folklore, where we derive our modern term genie from. They were said to be beings of smokeless fire. Again, a lot of similarities between the way that they behave and the way that some of these fairy folk behave. Many fairy scholars, and yes, they do exist, there are fairy scholars, suspect that fairy traditions, and by extension traditions like Djinn, the traditions, as perhaps the intelligences themselves do, travel with people, travel with cultures they are attached to through their various diasporas. There's evidence that fairy beliefs came over here with European settlers, and so it would make sense that perhaps Djinn beliefs would be imported to the Iberian Peninsula during the era that the region was controlled by the Moors. To reiterate, Djinn are often found in ancient ruins like the dolmen that Xavier visited. But here's something interesting that I don't think quite gets picked apart as much as it should in that old Flying Saucer Review article. Both Djinn and fairies have been known to create doubles in their respective bodies of folklore. I think that we can rule out the possibility that Xavier's double was a literal clone. From what we know, and granted this might change, you cannot create a carbon copy of another organism, and certainly you can't do it within hours, nor could you replicate the clothing that quickly. Now again, it's conceivable that at some point in the future we might have that technology, but that's not the way cloning works as we understand it right now. But in fairy and Djinn folklore, there are several references that you'll find time and again to doubles. In Islamic folklore, there is a double known as the Qareen, which is a Djinn that follows us from our birth to our death. It's often compared to another self, and it represents our internal struggle between good and evil. In European folklore, the Scottish co-walker is another type of fairy described by Robert Kirk, who wrote The Secret Commonwealth, and it's a double of its owner and even assists as a pallbearer at funeral banquets. After their owners die, the co-walker returns to fairyland. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If Xavier Jerez did encounter a Djinn or a fairy, these doubles in a lot of fairy folklore often have a defect. There's often something that betrays the fact that they aren't actual human beings whenever you see fairies and Djinn. This was such a prominent motif that fairy scholar Catherine Briggs included it in her dictionary of fairies. She said, among the many beliefs held about the fairies, there is one strand which describes them as beautiful in appearance, but with a deformity which they cannot always hide. This might be a hollow back, it might be one eye, it might be one nostril, it might be a giant tooth. Something about them would be a little bit wrong. And as luck would have it, the late Rosemary Ellen Guiley said more or less the same thing about the Djinn. Even when they appear in beautiful human form, Djinn are said to still have a physical flaw that exposes their true identity. Why is this important in the case of Xavier Clarés Jerez? Well, he had a double, which we know is something that you see in Djinn and fairy folklore, that had a defect, that had something that was different from the original. In this case, Xavier's hair was short now, and the double's hair was long. So one noticeable telltale difference. I think that's really interesting. What's even more interesting is that this sort of entity, this sort of double, appearing after UFO contact, is quite similar to another case from Spain in December of 1977. That year, Madrid's El Diario newspaper reported that Miguel Herrero Sierra had stopped his car for a nap. When he awoke, he saw a brightly lit flying saucer sitting on the side of the road. According to ufologist Scott Corrales, Miguel had exited his car to answer a voice in the early morning darkness. He thought maybe someone's car had broken down. That was when he saw the landed craft and was drawn inside. Once inside the craft, he met the crew. They all wore white uniforms and appeared human, but were not. The beings told Miguel that they had come to our world by chance. They had calculated a given speed at which to travel, found a void, and reached our dimension 2,000 years ago. Here's the pertinent part. The most peculiar being that Miguel met was his own double. Scott Corrales wrote, Herrera was at first shocked and frightened when he saw a man looking exactly like him seated at one of the stations. He said, my first reaction was to approach him, not to strike him, but to see someone who looked just like me up close. He was prevented from doing so, advised that he could not come into contact with his doppelganger or his negative, as Herrera put it. Miguel added, he was exactly like me, except that the scar which I bear on my left cheek was on his right. It's a double with a defect. Xavier Clarés Jerez, in the same country, 8 years later, had a double with a defect. I think that's really interesting. It's not saying that the case is true or false, just interesting. So what the heck is this, right? Is it a hoax? At the very least, it's a very wild case. It's been almost entirely forgotten. It's practically impossible to find information about this case online. Most, if not all, of what we know in the English-speaking world comes from that Flying Saucer Review article, and it kind of just disappears. As I said, Bill Chalker addressed it a little bit. You'll find it mentioned in passing here and there. I've mentioned it in a couple of my books, but it just doesn't get addressed. And so that makes it hard, especially if you're not a fluent Spanish speaker, to find out anything about what this case might have been or sort of its legacy today. So where are we with this? Well, there has been a slight development a couple of years ago. I guess 9 years ago now. Doesn't feel like it should be that long ago. But the only recent development that I have been able to find in this case comes from the website of late researcher Andreas Faber-Kaiser. Although Andreas passed away in 1994, his website is still online. A 2014 Nuevos Papers de OVNIs, pardon my pronunciation, by Jordi Ardenui from the University of Barcelona pointed to this website as proof positive that the Xavier Clarés Jerez abduction was a hoax. Although in Spanish, digging through the endnotes with Google Translate allowed me to find the website, then the specific comment that Ardenui mentioned. The post was made by a Mark M., who it appears may be running Andreas Faber-Kaiser's website after his death. Again, Google Translate is pretty limited in terms of getting a read on this. In response to a question about the Xavier Clarés Jerez abduction, Mark M. said the following on September 1st, 2019. Thanks again to Google Translate. As I already commented a while ago, the story of the Vallgorguina Djinns is completely false. A few months ago, I met Xavier C.'s ex-sister-in-law, and speaking of a dolmen that was close to where we were, she told me if the story of a boy who had been abducted by some intraterrestrials in Vallgorguina sounded familiar to me. She told me that such Xavier C. was her ex-brother-in-law, and he invented the story to give the note. Not entirely sure, it's probably just a quirk of the translation. One less mystery. According to Ardenui, who wrote the article sort of debunking the Jerez abduction, this Mark M. individual has further confirmed this through other personal communication. This exchange appeared to have happened after the death of Xavier's brother in May 1993. The sister-in-law's name is Rosa Martí Suarez. Notably, Jordi Ardenui indicates no public confession from Xavier himself has taken place. So we have a family member of his dead brother's wife, saying it was a hoax. Xavier has not come forward to declare it as a hoax. From what we know, Xavier was still alive as of 2014, operating at what Ardenui called a plastic artist of some prestige. I'm not sure if it's plastics or it's plastic surgery if he's changed professions, but yeah. So we have a family member who says it's a hoax. Where does this leave us? I have my own limitations, time, language barriers, and an inability to find Xavier online. Granted, I have not been able to concentrate on this as intensely as required, so that might be my own research shortcomings. So if anybody wants to take up this banner and try to track down more information on this, please, and please keep me in the loop, because I'm fascinated with this case, as you can tell. As far as the hoax allegations go, for me personally, maybe that's the case. Maybe it's a hoax. It'll be a lot easier if it was a hoax. But the case is so wild that it really flatters my inclination towards high strangeness. It seems like too wild a case to make up in some ways. For those of you who are married, how many of your in-laws would think well of you? And even for those of you who have good relationships with your spouse's families, how many of them would be willing to stand by you if you told this story? I don't think necessarily the idea that his ex-sister-in-law says that it's a hoax is necessarily proof positive that it is indeed a hoax. I remain agnostic on this case, although I find it fascinating. I present it here today in the hope that someone out there with more skills or time might be able to get to the bottom of it, if nothing else. It would be amazing to see the color photographs. If not, if there isn't any more information to be gotten, if we can just see these color photographs today, that would be fantastic. But all we have are these black and white scans. It will be interesting to analyze the photographs in color using today's methods. In summary, I assert that whether genuine or a hoax, the Xavier Clarés Jerez case deserves to be preserved for the sake of ufological history. I have to admit, given the deception that the phenomena seems to engage in, I find the frauds as fascinating as the facts, and the line in between the two is often not as clear as we would like it to be. So, with that being said, I would like to thank one more time Ryan and everyone who's involved in this. Thank you for the invitation. Here are some sources of where the slideshow came from and image credits. And if anybody is interested in my work, my website is joshuacutchin.com. I cover the Xavier Jerez Clarés case in a degree of detail, not as thoroughly as this, in my newest book set, Ecology of Souls, Volume 1 and Volume 2. What I'm really interested in those books is sort of digging into what the implications of that double might have meant in this particular case. So anybody who's interested in this case can look up that. And by the time this comes out, I may or may not have a novel that's available for purchase. So if I do, you can find out whether or not it's available at joshuacutchin.com, and you can always contact me personally. I have some sets of Ecology of Souls that I like to sell to people at a discount signed by me. So thank you so much, and I hope that everyone has a great rest of the weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing the other presentations.